And welcome back to Capitol Tonight. So ahead of the general election, EPL Environmental Advocates is looking back at the 2014 legislative session. The organization is giving each lawmaker a score based on how he or she voted on key bills. Those included a fracking moratorium, limits on the chemicals used in kids' toys, and regulation of oil trains, among others. Overall, members of the Assembly Democratic Conference had the highest scores, not surprising, averaging a 97, while their Republican counterparts had the lowest average score with a 57. In the Senate, the Democrats averaged an 89, the IDC 83, and the Republicans 63. With me now to talk more about the rankings is Pete Iwanowicz of Environmental Advocates. Thank you so much.
Nice to be back, Liz. Thanks again.
How many years is it now? This is an annual thing. This is not new.
Yeah, EPL Environmental Advocates was actually formed 45 years ago this year. Back in the late 60s, a group of people got together and said the environment needs a lobbyist in New York, so they created the Environmental Planning Lobby. We've changed the name like FedEx. Now we're known as EPL. So we get engaged in voter education. We put out our annual scorecard that looks at the legislative session, the priority issues for the environmental community, and sort of lays out there for the average voter how he or she did in terms of the elected officials.
We have a number of organizations that do this. Several business organizations do this too. They use their scores and extrapolate from them and then make endorsements. Do you do the same?
We don't endorse candidates. Our perspective really is look at the votes on the priority issues for the environmental community, rank people based on how they voted, either yes or no, and whether they supported things at the committee level, and let the voters decide whether or not that candidate is worth their re-election or not.
But that's not to say that you do not get involved politically. I mean, you will do voter education, you will do mailings.
Yeah, I don't know if you recall, but a year ago when I started the job, you and I were talking around this table and we said we're going to get very active in the next electoral cycle.
You did
so
say
here
that.
We are.
Yep.
We're going to spend about tens of thousands of dollars to ensure that this scorecard and the results of it show up in mailboxes, show up on door handles, emails and Twitter. We want voters to be very educated going into this electoral cycle of where elected officials are for the state legislature and the assembly are in these key issues.
But there isn't an official endorsement, but there is sort of an implied support for those who get 100. I mean, those who score higher obviously are in better graces, if you will, of environmental advocates than those who are, there's actually somebody here who's like 14, I think, right?
Exactly.
We'll get to that. But do you know what I mean? And also, you don't say candidates or legislators can't tout these. You don't say you can't use these, and they do.
No, they are. I mean, we've had 50 different members of the legislature actually retweeting this to their followers, their scores that we put out, and sort of letting folks know. We've had active dialogues with other members sort of quibbling about their scores, and ultimately they understand our scoring system and why they got what they did. They thought they voted yes and they really voted no, and then they have staff look at it, so they do it. What we really want to do is educate the public on core issues, and we write up the bills so people understand what bills we're scoring them on as part of our scorecard, where the legislature was on these issues, who voted up, who voted down, and why certain things were signed into law and certain things weren't.
Well, we can't go through all of them, but I do want to talk about a few of those bills. I mean, for example, the Child Safe Products Act, 40 co-sponsors. We've talked about this before in the Senate, but it was blocked from a fair up or down vote. And it's fascinating. Senator Mark Grisanti, who's now in this fight for his political life, and I actually didn't see where he's scoring specifically, but he's the Environmental Conservation Committee chairman, and several of his own bills died in his own committee.
Yeah, it's we think that the majority sort of conference approach here is failing our kids. We had a bill that had 40 co-sponsors. Now you only need 32 for it to pass.
Yeah, so it would have.
It wasn't brought to the floor, so it would have easily passed. A similar bill on a bad side had one co-sponsor in the Senate, was introduced, 3 days later it passed the Senate. So where there's a will, there's a way. That bill would have actually, if it gets signed into law by the governor, would legalize firecrackers and sparklers. EMS
that bill, yeah.
and firefighters have been against this well because it put kids at risk. So you have the Child Safe Products Act, 40 co-sponsors, no vote. The Firecrackers and Sparklers Legalization Act, one sponsor in the Senate, 3 days from introduction to full Senate passage.
Well,
that's just wrong.
To the governor's credit, though, he didn't sign it in advance of July 4th, for example, right? I mean,
it
which
still hasn't been delivered to him, so
right. So
I hope
we don't
he
know.
vetoes it because he shouldn't put kids at risk. But the point is, the Senate leadership should be bringing votes where you have a majority of senators already, more than a majority, on this co-sponsors. That bill should not have been blocked from a 4 vote. It should have been brought and the democratic process should have allowed for a fair hearing and a fair vote.
So then, I mean, one might extrapolate then, particularly since the Democrats do better than the Republicans, that you as an organization would prefer to see the Democrats take the majority.
No, we would actually prefer both parties actually to ensure that we have higher scores. We've also, we were talking about Mark Grisanti. I mean, he gets in the 60s for a score. The chair of the committee should not be scoring in the 60s. That's a failing grade. And as you pointed out, his own bills that he's sponsoring, he's not moving out of committee. So it's become a sort of a committee where good environmental policy goes to die, and it shouldn't be that way. That's what's another piece of this that is broken. What we also sort of point out is there are some really good actors. Senator Boyle, who's a Republican from Long Island, we give him an honorable mention for the work that he did to enlist support for a letter that they wrote to EPA Administrator saying set tight standards on carbon pollution from power plants because we need to get real active work on climate. We also recognize Assemblyman Saladino, a high score, a Republican in the Assembly. He scored an 83, the highest score of the Republican conference. He really votes not only with his conscience on these things, because the minority leader gets, from our perspective, an abysmal award with a 40.
40, yeah.
But Assemblyman Saladino is out there saying, my constituents and where I am as a value set is for strong environmental protection. So we really think that the environmental issues are bipartisan, and we're trying to sort of educate voters about the split that exists now. That shouldn't exist in this state.
We should note Assemblyman Sweeney, who's the chair of the
the
Environmental Committee. He is not running for re-election, and we don't know who's going to replace him, right? We still have no indication on that.
It's an open seat, obviously, and the chairmanship of that committee will be up and determined by the Assembly members when they get back and determine sort of where things are going to be.
Do you have any favorites? Do you have any scuttlebutt? I don't even hear anything at this point.
Just, any good lobbyist hears the rumor mill. There's a lot of names sort of out there. The Assembly has had a strong environmental voice over decades under the Speaker in particular. We're assuming they'll pick a chair that continues that philosophy that the Speaker has.
So 2 things I would be remiss if I did not tell everyone. It's Christopher Friend from Big Flats. He is the lowest scorer, and he's actually scored 14 points. This is the lowest, I think, in your history ever recorded. Yeah.
Yes.
He's also just historically low, so we shouldn't be terribly surprised. But 14 is,
It's
I don't even
abysmal.
know how he managed that.
That's the award. So we used to call it dishonorable mention, but now we sort of just flat and call out an abysmal. Because a record like that just is really not in keeping where the value set for New Yorkers is in terms of a strong environment, a healthy environment for people to grow and prosper, and a 14 is really an abysmal score.
So every year, though, you select somebody and single them out for a particular, not honorable mention, but sort of dishonorable mention. It's your Oil Slick Award.
Yeah.
Last year it went to Senator Klein. He's the IDC chairman. He's improved his score actually dramatically, so you're pleased.
Yeah.
This
From
year,
a 42 last year to an 83.
To an 83.
That's a big jump.
This year goes to Kathy Marchione. She's a Republican from the Capital District. Specifically, you take issue with the fact that she was leading the charge, along with some of her colleagues, on cutting red tape, if you will, an effort to reduce regulations, not specifically environmental regulations, or not uniquely environmental regulations, but a whole slew of them. She's been on the show to talk about it.
Yeah.
I just want you to know, and I'm sure you've heard from them, I have a 3-page, 2.5-page rebuttal from the senator, and she thinks this is unfair. It's from her office, I should say. I mean, have you spoken to them?
We did before the award was sort of bestowed. They sort of understood it. We walked them through the rationale why. I mean, she scores a 50 in the scorecard, but really, the Oil Slick Award was given to her for her strong advocacy to roll back key, not only environmental health, but labor regulations, public standards on public health as well. I mean, there are a slew of different things that she would like to see rolled back, and we think that's not only going to put the environment at risk, but it puts public health at risk.
But she's working with other colleagues, right? And there are other people who scored lower than she did. In other words, I guess what's the rationale when you guys sit down and say, okay, who's the person we really want to hold their feet to the fire this year? I mean, Klein I understood because he's a leader, and he has the power to make or break things, or at least halfway make or break things, because he's in this, or was in a bipartisan leadership coalition with Dean Skelos. But Marchione, she's actually relatively new.
She is new, and that's what sort of shocked us, is that right out of the gate she came into the Senate as a freshman, and in 2013 she moved through legislation that we rated a 3 smokestack, which means very egregious for the environment. It would have just said arbitrarily to the state agencies, cut 1,000 regs. No rhyme, no reason, no process, just cut 1,000 regs. To me, that's sort of legislating by soundbite. And why we really singled out Senator Marchione here was for her work to roll back key environmental protections. They issued a report in January with great fanfare. They were going to cut more than 2,000
remember it.
regulations.
Yep.
It was a big, hefty document. One of the regulations in there, though, was something that I think is very important. It would require the reduction of diesel emissions from the state fleet. The report just said, get rid of it. You get rid of DERA, which is the Diesel Emission Reduction Act, and you literally put kids' lives at risk. Seniors who get exposed to diesel exhaust have a greater rate of second heart attacks. It's a lung cancer agent. And some people who breathe in diesel soot over the years die prematurely as a result. We don't take these issues lightly. And because of what was at stake with her regulatory rollback platform, we really felt this was deserving of the Oil Sick Award because it puts tremendous numbers of New Yorkers at risk for health complications, and we're going to be breathing in dirtier air.
Okay, so she'll probably, we've invited her to come on and she'll have this opportunity to rebut, which is fair. Hopefully
Indeed.
we'll have an opportunity to talk to her. Again, this is not, you're not going up with any ad, you know, that sort of is like tarring her, literally, actually, when we talk about oil slicks. This is something that you're educating people about. You're not singling her out per se in your education.
No,
Right.
I mean, we're sort of out there sort of educating voters on the whole range of issues and where they are in the panoply of issues. And I urge people to really grab a copy of that majority coalition document, read through exactly what they wanted to repeal and strip and throw out. It's pretty breathtaking when you look at the environmental issues, when you look at the health issues, worker safety issues. More than 60 organizations joined us in January to a letter to the majority leader and co-leader Klein, and also to the speaker saying, don't do this. So it's not just environmental advocates that sort of rose up on this issue. A whole panoply of groups really took offense to it. If they had been successful, they could have turned New York State into what we saw in West Virginia, where they had no standards. There was a huge chemical spill, and millions were without drinking water because there was no regulatory oversight.
But
regulations can improve life and improve public health, but they also matter.
But it has not passed, so we
no,
should just be clear to people.
That's true.
West
it was alive
Virginia,
in January and dead by February.
West
but it was
Virginia.
such a big issue that we felt like on environmental issues, this had to be singled out, and she was the champion.
Understood. West Virginia is safe in its dubious distinction at this point.
Yes.
I thank you so much, Peter Iwanowicz, for being with me. I do appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. Always a pleasure.
My pleasure.